Let me begin. Several of you have asked, and so I'll answer to everyone at once, and then we'll save some time. I am on sabbatical. Hallelujah. I think. I have a bad habit of 3 years ago or 2 years ago, someone will have contacted me and said, we're putting together an anthology, but you write a 4,000-word piece on this or that. 4,000 words, to me, to my students, that sounds like, good Lord, how long will it take me? To me, that's a couple afternoons' work, supposedly, if I've got the research done. And so I've said yes to I don't know how many of those kinds of things. And before I can really turn my attention to my sabbatical project, I can't have all those things floating around in my head. So I'm in the process of trying to clear off the desk so I can actually get to work, and it's not going as quickly as I could wish. That's fine. Partly because I've had a busy family period in my life. It was up and down. We had a couple of weddings. So now, I've been looking forward to being a grandfather for about 10 years. And I see no reason now why we can't proceed with that. Except my wife will not allow me to say that out loud in front of people who might help. I will never forget as long as I live. My oldest was about 2 days old, and my supervisor in graduate school came to visit with me with his daughter, who had been married for about 2 years. And we were standing in the hallway, and he looked at me and he said, now, Mark, you've done everything you can now. He turned and looked at his daughter. He said, to become a grandfather. So we're waiting on that. The elderly in my family are requiring more and more of our attention. So I'm finding that I don't have quite as much. This period in life, somebody should have warned me about the truth about it. As a young professor with children at home, I thought, boy, when I'm in my 50s and 60s, that'll be cruise mode. I won't be begging people to let me publish something. They'll be asking me, which they are. I won't be dealing with children. They'll be grown and gone, which they are. You all know well enough how that fills in. So I think I am probably getting more work done than I ever have in my life, and I'm more tired because of it. But it'll go well. I'll get the things done that need to be done. We're looking at this United Monarchy period in Israel. It's a strange circumstance. And the literature that deals with it raises a number of problems with it. Let's set this thing in the context of history. And then we have some terminology questions to deal with. Because in talking about this, we have to use our terms precisely in the way in which academics in the field do, or you will misunderstand me at some point, and we'll have trouble. And looking at these terminological issues is going to raise some questions for us that I want us to pay attention to for the next 5 Sundays, counting today. First of all, we're talking about a very limited period of time. When you talk about ancient Israel's history, it's very difficult to date things until you get down about the 6th century BCE, around the time of Jeremiah and the Babylonian crisis. Everything before that is plus or minus, a year or two, in some cases plus or minus a decade or two, in some cases plus or minus a century. Right. But we think the time period we're talking about from the time when Saul became king and was succeeded by David, who was succeeded by Solomon, and upon his death, his son Rehoboam messed things up for the United Monarchy, and Israel split into 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom we call Israel, the southern kingdom we call Judah. The time period between when Saul became king and when Rehoboam screwed things up, that was about 50 years, about 926 to 876. Remarkably, when you look at the part of the Bible that deals with Israel's history while it was a kingdom or 2 kingdoms, you're talking there about the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So that's 4 books. Of those 4 books, most of 2nd Samuel, all the way into 1st Kings, so roughly one quarter of those 4 books deal with David. David, who was king probably for about 30 years. That tells us something about what we're dealing with. I'm not, or no, it doesn't tell us things. It raises questions, actually, about what we're dealing with when we deal with David, and I want us to remember that in a minute. Let me give you sort of the plan of what we're going to do. With 5 Sundays, I deal with this section of literature in the Old Testament survey, introduction in the seminary, in 5 weeks of classes. So we've got 5 hours. I usually have about 20. So, woo! Seat belts, if you have them, you might want to put them on. Let's turn to the what we're going to do talk about these terminological issues and start on Saul. I hope we can do all of Saul today. We'll see. Depends on how efficient I am. And I want us to have 3 Sundays for David because of what I mentioned. A fourth of the literature is devoted to him. We should deal with him in greater depth than the other 2 kings. And then we'll finish up with Solomon. Okay. What are the terminological things I want us to be clear on? Let's start with history, the word and the concept. In our Bibles, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Ruth, Nehemiah, all of those are considered historical books. And let's make sure we're clear on what we mean when we talk about history. We actually cannot call these books historical in the sense that we would use if we were in a university class on early American history. Why not? Well, because by definition, history examines on the basis of source material which is evaluated critically, which means that if you have the letters of Abraham Lincoln and you have the letters of Mary Lincoln talking about the same event, especially later in Mary's life when she was not quite right, then you don't give them the same weight historically, right? You have to be critical about how you evaluate. Primarily, however, history, the term we use, is an account of human affairs involving human and natural causation. Whenever in literature class, you'll remember from studying the classics, probably Homer anyway, that phrase deus ex machina. Do you remember that? As soon as a god steps on the stage, it's not history anymore. Because history is about what happens in human affairs, natural and human causation. Right? So if you say, well, we won the Civil War because the Civil War came out the way the Civil War came out because God wanted it to, right? Then you have to say, well, where do you see God's hand? And then that becomes very difficult, doesn't it? Especially if you know the history of that war or any other. If you know the history of any economic circumstance or any outcome in social affairs, then to say that God put his hand on the scale here, right in this moment, oh boy, is that difficult to do. It's something, by the way, I discourage people from doing. Because when you make a statement like that, you usually reveal less of what you know about God and more of your own bias. I mean, recently, all sort of people whom I don't agree with theologically have said that this hurricane or that hurricane is because of this or that, social ill or sin or problem in an area. And that's just, I don't know how you can see through to see that. Plus, hurricanes have the tendency to wipe out. Well, Jesus said it rains on the just and the unjust. And that they have a tendency to wipe out the sinner's house and the not sinner's house right next door. And so I have difficulty with any modern saying, God's at work in human history here, here, here. Now, as a believer, however, I believe that God is at work in human history. I'm just not sure I know when and where and how to identify that. Well, when we turn to the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Ruth, Esther, and so forth, we're dealing with.
You can tell you're Baptist.
Yeah. We're dealing with what we call historical books because they tell us something of Israel's history. But guess what? They are written from the standpoint not only of a conviction that God's at work in human history, but the authors of these books are pretty well convinced They know when, where, how, and why. But they're biblical authors, and we're not. Right? My point is, we are not dealing with history in the university sense. We're dealing with theological history, which to a trained historian is an oxymoron. Is everybody with me? I'll go ahead and tell you what's the main theological part of this history. And we find this stated clearly all the way back in the book of Judges. And by the way, in modern scholarship, we know the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, just those 6. We know them as a 6-volume single work that may have undergone a couple of editions. We call it the Deuteronomistic history. I'll go ahead and tell you why that is. In 623 or thereabouts, while they were renovating the temple under Josiah, the king, someone found HaSefer HaTorah, the scroll of the law, over behind a piece of furniture or hidden in a wall or something. And they read it and they thought, oh, this is important, and they brought it to the king. You can read about this in 2 Kings 22 and 23. And they read it, and the king said, oh my goodness, we hadn't been doing this. And what are we going to do? And someone said, well, let's go ask Huldah, the prophetess, what we should do. And they went and asked her, and she said, it's the scroll of the law, and it says what to do. Why are you asking me? Do it. And so Josiah undertook a series of reforms. We call them the Reforms of Josiah, or the Deuteronomic reforms, because the language in 2 Kings 23, especially describing what Josiah did, is language straight from the book of Deuteronomy. Straight from the book of Deuteronomy. So, as early as, I think, Jerome, back in the 300s of the Common Era, was the first to suggest that the scroll they had found was probably a form of the book of Deuteronomy. Now, basically, what does Deuteronomy say? Deuteronomy says in a nutshell, here's the law of God. If you obey it, God will, what? Bless you. If you disobey it, God will curse you. Right? And so, the theme of this literature, Joshua through 2 Kings, which was written, by the way, just after the Babylonians came. You follow me? Because the last thing in 2 Kings is a description of Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem and plundering of the temple. So, we're pretty well convinced that this literature was written by someone or someones who needed to explain, historically and especially theologically, why it is that we, God's people, have just been wiped out if God loves us. And the answer, of course, you find from their perspective, in the book of Deuteronomy. So they put this paradigm over all of Israel's history from entry into the land, Joshua, to 586, the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem and the exile and all that sort of stuff, Nebuchadnezzar. And it is the following. You find it in Judges chapter 2, verses 6 through chapter 3, verse 6. It is as follows. We sin from time to time. God abandons us to our enemies. We cry out, oh Lord, we're in trouble. God delivers us. And the cycle repeats itself. According to the Deuteronomistic history, the cycle repeats itself from the days of Joshua all the way down to Nebuchadnezzar. That's 430 approximately years of a cycle repetitive. The authors reprise this theme again in 2 Kings chapter 17 when they report the fall of the northern kingdom. They say, see there, it's happened at some point. The point of the Deuteronomistic history is, at some point after delivering us, and we repeat that cycle of apostasy, and God delivers us again, and we don't learn our lesson, and we repeat the cycle of apostasy, and God delivers us again. And after 450, 600 years of that, God said, okay, enough. And the Babylonians come in, whoosh. Of course, now, I don't want to leave us there, because after the exile, along come a series of prophets who say that before there was a covenant, there was a promise with Abraham. And we may have broken the covenant, but our ability to sin does not restrict or define God's ability and determination to keep God's promise. God's promise is more important than the covenant contract we made. Is everybody with me? So I don't want to leave you there. But if you're sitting in 586 and use your historical imagination. In our case, it would be as though we don't have an enemy like the Babylonians. The Canadians, not really mad. and just burned Washington to the ground, and took the Senate and the whole Congress, all of the government. Some would say hallelujah. Subjected us to humongous taxes. That's not what they're called in this context. But anyway, and just went through the countryside and burned and looted and pillaged. We'd be going, wait a minute. We thought we were the great democratic experiment in the world. Some of us thought of ourselves as the new Israel, almost, as God's chosen, the city on the hill. What has gone wrong? And at that point, imagine some historian standing up and say, well, actually, we've made some pretty bad mistakes along the way. And, these roosters, these sins have come home to roost on us. And so that's what we're talking about, okay? So yes, please.
I know there's no answer to this, but if somebody comes up to you who is unchurched,
right,
and says, if your God is so great and created all this, why did it take 500 years for these wandering Jewish people? Why did they
keep doing it over and over again?
Why didn't they learn something?
That's the point, actually, of the Deuteronomy. That's the question this history asks itself and its people, by the way. See, now here's what, okay, we're going to have to make an agreement. So these are good questions. If I answer them well, the last Sunday together, I'm going to say, Solomon! So I'm going to go with that question, but understand that that's going to be the outcome. This is the question that hangs over another book in the Bible, which is very heavily influenced by the book of Deuteronomy. By the way, if you wanted to become a biblical scholar and you wanted to know what biblical book to start, because it's the most influential book on the whole rest of the Bible, it is the book of Deuteronomy. Jesus quotes it more than any other Old Testament book. Paul quotes it second only to Isaiah. He loved Isaiah, but after Isaiah comes Deuteronomy and then Psalms. Within the Old Testament, Deuteronomy pops up everywhere. Deuteronomy was influential on Jeremiah, influential on Ezekiel, influential on Hosea. Okay, now, there's a chapter in Deuteronomy that already deals with that, and Jeremiah picks it up later, and Ezekiel does too. And it is the chapter on the heart, Deuteronomy 30. Moses says to the Israelites, just as he's about to die, he says, now, I've laid all of this out for you. And it ain't that hard. Right? He said, it's not in heaven that you have to send someone up to bring it down. It's not in the depths of the sea that you have to. It's right here. It's simple. How hard is it not to kill somebody? Thou shalt not kill. How hard is it not to worship another God? Right? If you think about the Ten Commandments, doing them perfectly is going to be impossible. But most of us can come down to the end of the day and say, let's see. Didn't worship Baal, didn't kill anybody, and committed adultery today. Hey, pretty good day. Right? Mostly that's all we're asking of you. But Moses seemed to know in advance that for some reason or other, people just... And he said what is going to be necessary is a change of heart. Now, In the Old Testament, the heart has to do not with emotion, but in Hebrew thinking, it has to do with volition. A friend of mine used to say that what happens is we get our want to straight, right? Because once you get your want to straightened out, then the rest of it's okay. And Moses says, it's not that you can't, it's that you just don't, for some reason, some sorry reason, don't really want to. Jeremiah comes along later in Jeremiah 31 to 34 with that. Everybody knows this, with the notion about the covenant, a new covenant written where? On our hearts. Right? And as an Old Testament professor, I want to point out that the only difference in the new covenant and the old covenant is not the content. Right? Still no killing. Still no committing adultery. Still no worshiping other gods. It's that now, rather than written on tablets of stone, Jeremiah says, and you won't be teaching each other, right? Because it's written down somewhere externally. It'll be written in your want to. Right? And that's the only way. So that's the answer to that question. That's the big theological question. Why are human beings so prone to sin? And the answer is because we seem to be prone to sin. And what is necessary is a new want to. Now, was that helpful?
Sort of.
Yeah. But I mean, the Bible grapples with this. But the answer is, think about we're as individuals, we all know this. I'm old enough to know better than to do some of the things I still do from time to time. And I go, why didn't I should have learned that lesson when I was 28. What's wrong with me? And what's wrong with me is what's wrong with all of us. Right? Okay, so the history issue. Is everybody clear with me on one? I say when we're called this history, we don't mean what they do in history class in university. Which leads us to, well, what is it in literary genre? I've said that these 6 books that are we call in modern scholarship the Deuteronomistic history. They belong together. And the Hebrew Bible, by the way, the Hebrew Bible is not ordered the same way our Bible is. Our Bible follows a Protestant tradition. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the Torah, the 5. And the next section in the Bible are the prophets. And they are Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, what we call the Deuteronomistic history in modern scholarship. Ruth is not in there. Right. They're called the former prophets. Wait a minute. The latter prophets, by the way, are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the major prophets, and then the book of the 12, the minor, Hosea through Malachi. The books of Ruth, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, those are in the 3rd section of the Bible altogether. They are not considered prophets. But wait a minute. Have you ever thought of Joshua as a prophetic book? When you hear the word prophet, what do you think? Someone who, what, tells the future. Yeah. Well, Joshua's not telling the future. 2 Kings is not telling the future. It's talking about distant past already by the time it was written down. Which means, and here you have to think historically, which means you have 2 options. We get in our time machine and go back to the ancient Israelites who gathered these books together and said, you named it wrong, right? Or they meant something by prophet, something other than what we tend to think of. Is everybody with me? Mm-hmm. And so we're going to have to rethink what prophecy is. The book of 2 Kings was written well after the fact. But the book of Jeremiah, was written well after the fact too. It begins by saying, this is the things that have to do with Jeremiah that came during the reigns of king, up until the fall of Babylon. The book of Jeremiah ends with Jeremiah 52, which is a description of the Babylonians coming and wiping things out. So that by the time the book of Jeremiah is written as a book, everything Jeremiah had said would come, what? Had already come and happened. Now that gives us a clue. Prophetic literature in the Hebrew Bible is telling you a story about what happened, or in some cases, prophets who warned about something going to happen. And it looks back on those moments after the fact, when all of these things have already come true. So whereas when Jeremiah preached, he was trying to convince people to change their mind. The book of Jeremiah is trying to do something else. What would you think that would be? It's for people after, and it's so they can look back and say, now wait a minute, let's hypothesize that if that's the way God reacted to that kind of situation in the past, that is how God, on the theory that God doesn't change, and on the theory that people don't change that much. Right. We have here an advance warning of what's going to happen to us if we don't, right, shape up. This is so. In the Old Testament prophetic literature, it has an admonitory function, a teaching function, a warning function, an encouraging function. Look to your history and tradition and learn from it. Right? That's not bad advice.
Well, we certainly have the same thing in the same, those who forget history
Are doomed to repeat
are
it.
doomed to repeat
That's
it.
exactly right. And boy,
Does it?
we see it today. I mean, I could describe the time period we live in generically as a time when the global economy was in disarray, and there was a rise in nationalist sentiment and tendency all across the world, and an increasing mistrust of the other, and a polarization along socioeconomic lines. What am I describing? When am I describing? Well, today, but the 1930s, yeah, and the 1850s, and okay. There are four of these terms: theology, prophecy, theodicy. Now, this is the big one. If we love God and God loves us, and the Babylonians have come and wiped us out, then the tendency would be to conclude, A, that, well, you got several options. God doesn't love us. God never has loved us. God's not powerful enough to keep this kind of thing from happening. Right? So it becomes important for the authors of Joshua through 2 Kings to, theodicy means, you break it down, it means to justify God. Right? And the answer becomes no. How much patience do you expect of God? Is 600 years enough? Right? Is 40, 50, 60 cycles, or 40, 50, 60 cycles of this save you and you commit apostasy again? How many times? 70 times 7. But I said it turns out that this wasn't the end after all. It felt like the end to the Judeans at the time. So theodicy is important, and theodicy continues to be important in the world, especially if you look at human history. And then a final one, and this may be the biggest one. It kind of subsumes all of them. And it is the concept of irony. More and more, I've written on this with respect to these passages and several others. Increasing scholarly consensus is that the view of history held by this material is ironic. Now let's talk about irony. It's a subcategory, oddly enough, of humor. Irony, we misuse it all the time. We say, "Oh, that was ironic." But in the technical sense, irony means something is going on, and it's not clear to everybody what the real truth is here. Let me illustrate one biblical example. We all know this passage when the high priest in Jerusalem, and they're talking about what to do with Jesus, says, well, it's better for one man to die for his whole country than it is for the Romans to come in and give us trouble. He didn't realize he had just described exactly what Jesus had come to do. Right? So he had spoken the truth without knowing it. That's irony. The question that ironic literature asks, or an ironic event asks an observer, is, can you see through the apparent to the truth? Are you insightful enough? We're going to see this a lot. When, for example, Saul will say at one point, what more can David have but my kingdom? You don't want to say, Saul, buddy, if you were paying attention, you'd recognize he's already got it. And you're wasting your time. Yeah. All right, well, quick little pause. And I want to do two things. Carolyn, how long do I have? How fast do I have to go?
You have about 30 minutes.
Oh, good. I'm going to pause here for 5 minutes of questions, or we don't get to talk about something. Anybody have some? I want you to keep your ironic ears and eyes open. Everywhere, everything we read. Okay? Everything we talk about. Any questions, comments? All right. We're going to turn to Saul now. We'll be turning to 1 Samuel chapter 8. While I set this up. After the period of the judges, when things had not gone so well, I used to teach the judges differently until I wrote a book on them. And then I learned a book on the book of Judges, and then I learned what I had been doing right. This was the time period when Israel was led by these charismatic leaders. They'd get in trouble, right? Remember? And God would raise up a judge. Everything would go okay, and then the judge would die, and then there could be apostasy again. That's where the pattern begins clearly. And after being delivered over into the hands of the Moabites, or the Ammonites, or the Midianites, or the Amalekites, one after the other, the people would say, "Oh, wait," and God would raise up another judge. There was Samson, there was Jephthah, there was, on and on and on. Toward the end of that period, the book of Judges repeats 1 Samuel chapter 8. Toward the end of that book of Judges, it repeats the refrain, and in those days there was no king, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Okay, so as a Baptist, as a Protestant, this notion that God raises up charismatic, it's not because you inherited it, it's not because none of that. It's because people need a leader, and God calls up a charismatic leader. Here I am, imbued with the Spirit of God to deliver them. Boy, that's even Presbyterians can get excited about that. I liked that. But then I began to notice, it's very ineffective. After the Midianites come and conquer you, then or the army is coming. This is the case with Gideon. The army's coming, the Philistine army, and God raises up Gideon. First thing Gideon has to do is raise his own army to answer. And you don't say to the enemy who's encamped against you, got their battle plans drawn up, would you wait a couple of weeks? I got to get my army. So first of all, you got to wait till you're in trouble, and then it's ineffective. And thirdly, there's nobody to regulate things, and everybody's doing right in their own eyes. Right? Samuel comes along. He's a little bit different. He does a good job. Except, it turns out that he has sons who are no better than he is. And the Israelites come to Samuel, this is in 1 Samuel 8, and say, look, this is not working. Just wait until we're in trouble to get a leader. And we can't do it, judgeship doesn't seem to hand down well because your sons are scoundrels. So after you, we don't want them. What we want is a king. So we can have some order and some reliability and some stability like every other nation in the world. And Samuel doesn't like it because he feels it, first of all, as a rejection of his own leadership, but also as a rejection of the notion, if you've got this charismatic leader, kings become institutions, right? A charismatic leader is dependent solely on God's calling and God's power. And so Samuel says, this is not a good idea. You're rejecting it. And so he goes to God, and God says, well, not my plan either, but it's what they want, so let's give it to them. But let's warn them about it. 1 Samuel, not 18, which is what I have, not 2 Samuel 18. 1 Samuel 8, chapter 1 Samuel 8, verse 10. Now, in terms of writing this kind of history, it's important for the authors to state the things you need to be watching for, right? And here they have announced what they think is going to be a pattern which will characterize the whole of Israel's monarchical period, every king they ever had. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implement of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slave. And in that day, you will cry out." Now there's that word that's part of the... So when Israel gets in trouble and the Edomites and the Moabites or the Ammonites oppress them, they cry out to God for deliverance. This is the verb we find in Exodus chapter 2. When after the Pharaoh has made life hard for the Israelites, they cry out. And God hears their cry and remembers his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The day is coming, Samuel warns the people, when you will cry out for deliverance the way you cried out for deliverance from Pharaoh, who had oppressed you and made you slaves. The way you cried out for deliverance from the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the Philistines. You will cry out for deliverance from your own king, who will be as oppressive, almost, as the Pharaoh. In other words, God said, "I've liberated you from slavery once. When the king you have asked for enslaves you, but the Lord will not answer. You've chosen this for yourself," Samuel says. "Are you ready?" The word "take" appears. Gosh, how many times did you hear it? Take. What do kings do? Take. How many kings down the way before we find a king who is a taker in Israel's history?
David?
Yeah, 2. Takes 2. Like the old Tootsie Roll Pop. How many bites do you get to the center? 2. You know. And by the time we get to Solomon, he is described in language in Hebrew, which is reserved elsewhere in the Bible only for Pharaoh. What does Solomon do when we get to? He builds things, and he used forced labor. He drafts you into the building project. What did Pharaoh do? Drafted them into it's the same thing over and over. So this hangs over the history of the Israelite monarchy. When I'm assuming that you all may be like my students. When they come to class, having been in Vacation Bible School, everybody knows Saul was a bad guy, right? Not so much, but everybody thinks he's a bad guy. And David is the darling, the hymnist, right? King David, sweet and wonderful, adulterer, murderer, liar, and thief. And Solomon's wise enough to enslave his people so that they revolt after he's dead. And the monarchy splits into 2 separate kingdoms. What was the word I said? Idly. What seems to be going on is not necessarily what's at the core of it. I'm going to summarize the rest of Saul's career so that we can have time for questions. After this, you know the story. Saul is the son of Kish, a Benjamite, and Saul's daddy, Kish, has lost his asses. I love this. And so Saul and a servant go on a big ass hunt. And they don't have any luck, and just about the time Saul's about to give up, his servant said, "Well, I know there's a prophet in the area, Samuel, the one we just heard from. Maybe he can help us find the donkeys." So they go, and on the way, while they're coming, God says to Samuel, the king that we've going to promise is on the way. You're going to meet him in a minute. And so Saul comes in. Now, we learn later that Saul's a head taller than everybody else, impressive, strong individual with a certain tendency to shyness, because he hides out later on, when everybody's looking for him. And a certain tendency toward schizophrenia or something. It's dangerous to use modern terms to diagnose literature that's this old. But you'll see these. Pay attention to these ideas when I mention them. So they have a conversation, and Samuel says, "Your dad's already found the donkey. Don't worry about it." He anoints him to be king of Israel. Now, you should know this. This is one of the things that's handed down onto us today in our ordination practice. By us, I mean Protestants. We think of two stages in a calling to be a minister, as Israel thought of two stages in a calling to be king. One is the anointing of God, that sense, that personal sense. But in our ordination is about the congregation, the community, recognizing in the individual the gift of God that has been planted there. People can think they're called by God, when the rest of us look at them and say, I don't know if you've been listening very carefully. Right? I don't know what God called you particularly to do. But when the community says yes, we recognize in you the gifts of God and the calling of God, we ordain them. In ancient Israel, usually a prophet anointed someone, but it took the ratification of the people before you actually became king. Saul was ratified on 2 occasions. By the way, Saul was doubtful about this, and Samuel says, okay, on your way out of here, you're going to pass near the Philistine border, and there's a garrison of Philistines there. And associated with that garrison of Philistines are some Philistine prophets. Now, in Canaanite culture, prophet didn't mean what it meant. In Israelite culture, they were usually ecstatics, whirling dervish kind of folks who get all, whoo! On his way through there, the Spirit of God fell upon Saul, and he ended up naked, writhing in the middle of the road, having an ecstatic fit. And that gave rise to the proverb, is Saul also among the prophets? Samuel said, that'll be a good indication for you that what I'm telling you is true. Now, the Bible preserves 2 accounts for how the people ratified Saul as king. I don't want to get into those, except to say that one of them involved him hiding around behind a wagon because he didn't want to be seen. But they still ratified him as king. His career, the literature that is devoted to him comprises only 3 chapters in the Bible. 3 episodes. 1 Samuel 13, war with the Amalekites, King Agag. Typically, before going to war, Samuel, or later on some other prophet, would come along and, they'd have a worship service and say, may God bless this endeavor, and let's go with God, and yay, and go. And Saul had raised his army, was about to go to the war with the Amalekites. Samuel had said, I'll be there Tuesday. Wednesday came, Thursday came, Friday came. No Samuel. And this was less than a militia, right? This was, y'all come help me fight this war. And they say, okay, we get it done by Thursday, but I got to get the crops in, And people were getting restless to go home. And Saul didn't want to start without them. So he said, okay, I'll offer the sacrifice and say the prayers and the blessings, and then we'll go on. Now, in ancient Israel, you have to know, who is qualified to offer sacrifices and stuff like that? Someone born of the tribe of Levi. Saul was a Benjamite. Well, wouldn't you know it? As soon as he had offered the sacrifice, along came Samuel. And Samuel said, what are you up to here? He said, well, I was waiting on you, and you never came, and they were getting ready, and I said, and he says, obedience is better than sacrifice. Chapter 14. They're going to go to war with the Philistines. Saul's son Jonathan was out reconnoitering. And Saul said, okay, new rule. In ancient Israel, there were the holy war rules. You know about those, Deuteronomy 20. This is, if you're going into battle on a holy occasion, these are the things you do because God said so. Saul added to that. He said, we're going to fast until we've won this battle. Jonathan didn't know he'd said that. Jonathan was out in the woods, reconnoitering. They were hungry. They came upon a honey tree. And he and his small company all had some honey. And the Bible says in the King James Version, it was good. Their eyes became bright. They burned it. Meanwhile, the main battle goes on. It's horrible for the Israelites. Saul rounds everybody up and starts casting lots. He says, this is because someone has broken the oath I put on you to fast. I'm going to find out who it is. And in stupid fashion, he began by dividing everybody into him and Jonathan on one side, everybody else on the other. And he says, okay, Lord, you know about the Urim and the Thummim, where you pull out a rock and it's either white or black or green or red, and one means yes and one means no. He said, the center is either amongst me and Jonathan or everybody else. Who is it? You and Jonathan. And Saul says, did you find it? He said, yeah, we found some honey and we ate it. And he said, well, I've vowed that whoever did that's going to have to die. You're going to have to die. And the people interceded on Jonathan's behalf and wouldn't let him. Now, what we have here in narrative form is, in the first instance, with the offering, Saul usurped a privilege that was not his. That is, he behaved as a priest when he was not supposed to. In the second case, he usurped a privilege which was not his, which is to establish holy war regulations. Who gets to decide how God wants you to conduct a war? God does, not the king. Right? Besides which, it was a stupid idea. Who ever heard of the best way to win a war or a football game is to starve yourself for a day or so? That's a stupid thing. And who ever heard of making such a stupid vow? By the way, I could go on about that. We've grown up with the notion, if you vow to God, you better do it. Remember Jephthah and his daughter. The book of Proverbs says, if you make a stupid vow, it's a stupid vow. How do you vow to God to do something that is against God's will? Because God holds you accountable to do something which violates God's will in the first place. Are you following me? So that's number two. Third strike, you're out. Right? Saul conquers some places. In holy war, in Israelite war, you're not supposed to plunder your enemy. And you're not supposed to leave the king and stuff like that alive. Along comes Samuel, right? And he says, did you do what you're supposed to do? And Saul says, yeah. And he said, what then, to quote the King James, is this bleating of sheep in my ears? And by the way, isn't that the enemy king you have right there? And Saul says, oh, I did it. The people did it. In other words, 3 times in a row, Saul thinks that the king, he, has the privilege and the prerogative to do something other or in addition to the explicit command of God. You follow me? So Samuel says, well, I'm sorry. And he rips a chunk off of Saul's robe and he says, God has torn the kingdom from you and is going to give it to someone better than you. That's 1 Samuel chapter 15. In 1 Samuel chapter 16 is the famous story of young little David being anointed king. Right? So it doesn't last long. Poor Saul. Now he is on the throne in terms of the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, all the way down through the end of 2nd Samuel. So he's around for a long time. But beginning already in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, we have David on the scene as the anointed successor. And so we'll talk about him for the next 3 Sundays. Questions or comments? By the way, you could say that although Saul wasn't taking fields and people and houses and money, he was taking privilege, prerogatives that were not his to take. One of the things about being a supreme leader, an executive officer, or whatever you want to call it, and whether you're talking about king, president, dictator, whatever, you get that power and you think, I've got this army. It's my army. I'm going to use it. I've got this government. It's going to obey me. I've got this. Maybe that was the way you guys did it, but I'm doing it this way. I mean, I hope you don't think I'm just talking about one individual around today, although that individual is illustrative of the attitude Saul had, I think, and all of them do. It's you get to be the head honcho, and you want to be the head honcho, don't you? Yes.
Were the Levites supposed to understand God's will?
No, not necessarily understand it, but they were the ones who were responsible for doing the sacrificing and stuff like that, and that was just I answered you too quickly. They were responsible for Torah. They were supposed to be learned in the Mosaic Law and interpreters of it. The Old Testament is more reticent to talk about people knowing God's will in the, what is it, Second Isaiah says, I am man and I am God and not man. My thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are as far above, So the whole notion that any human being can see into the mind of God would be considered by the Old Testament a little bit ridiculous.
My confusion is, if the king was not supposed to make decisions based on his thinking.
Well, no, it's not a question of decision making. It's a question of, well, yeah, but okay, I'll answer your question now. I know what it is. There's an explicit section of the law which describes how to conduct war. And he violated two of those provisions and substituted his own thinking in a third case, in a stupid way. I mean, let's go to war by first fasting. That's just stupid. And then going to punish Jonathan, even though Jonathan hadn't heard Saul didn't prove to be a very wise individual. But the main point is, though, you don't get, when it's explicitly lined out, this is what you do. And you're the king of Israel, even though you are the king of Israel. You don't get to say, but I'm the king. I'm going to suspend that for now. There's no suspending the will of God. There's one chapter in Deuteronomy, which is called the Law of the King. And it says that he should have a copy of the law and should read it every day. Because the idea is he's not an absolute monarch in the sense that some of the other kings of the ancient Near East. He's not a constitutional monarch either. He is a monarch under the restrictions of God's covenant. And even kings aren't able to, or should not, transcend that. Although he's not the first king in Israel's history. Well, he is the first king, but he's not the last king in Israel's history to do so. Yes. Yes and yes.
Am I supposed to get a message that there's clearly powers higher than the king?
And if you're a king, one of the messages is, if you're Israel's king, if you want to stay king, you better recognize that. Right? If you don't recognize that you are, God chosen, God directed, God allowed, God commissioned, then you won't get to be king long. Yes.
I was struck that Saul, being the first king, he was tall and handsome, and I wonder if that isn't sort of a beware in the television era.
We're going to get that in the very next chapter, so remember what she said next Sunday. Because I mentioned irony. The author is going to make sure we know that that's what we're supposed to be looking for in the very next chapter, 1 Samuel 16. And it's going to have to do with appearance. Yes.
Remind us again, who wrote the Deuteronomical law? I mean,
The book of Deuteronomy?
Yeah, who is it that determined the law?
The
You
book
say
of,
it's God's law, but who wrote it?
we don't know.
Well, how was it determined?
Well, see, it's Mosaic. Well, Mosaic tradition, at least, right? Deuteronomy purports to be Moses pausing in the Transjordan just before Israel enters the land and just before he dies. A generation has passed since those who entered into the covenant with God at Mount Sinai. Right? Now, not only has a generation passed, so that they weren't privileged, Daddy signed this contract, I didn't. But circumstances are about to change radically. It's one of those important parts of the book of Deuteronomy and why it's so important in the rest of the Bible, and that is, you take the Ten Commandments, my favorite one to illustrate this is, honor your father and mother. Okay, when you're wandering in the wilderness, honoring your father and mother would mean one thing. It meant one set of behaviors and one set of problems. When you settle in the land now, right, and you're agrarian and not wandering, honoring father and mother, that acquires a whole new set of, and Moses said, we're about to change circumstances radically. We're not going to be wandering nomads anymore. We're going to settle this land. I'd better go over with them the implications of the Ten Commandments for their new circumstances. And that's the book of Deuteronomy. By the way, implicit in that is a whole hermeneutic of the Bible, as far as I'm concerned. The question becomes, is canonical scripture fixed and unchangeable? Yes. Do circumstances change? Yes. Is it necessary in each generation to ask yourself, how do I act faithfully toward this, which hasn't changed? What my that's why I like to pick honor father and mother. Right? As long ago as my grandparents' generation, that meant one thing, and it doesn't mean that now, by the way. And that commandment is not about when you're a little kid, it's about when you're a grown up, your parents are aged. Right? Honoring father and mother for my grandparents was one thing. For me, it's another altogether. It's very, as many of you know, very, very complicated. The requirement hasn't changed, right? The means of accomplishing it have. And the Bible, already in the book of Deuteronomy, says you've got to be ready for that. Right? That's going to be the challenge always to each generation. We're dividing, I'm going to give you a little commercial. We're dividing, as scholars do, David's career into three periods. The first we call his rise to prominence. This is between when he's a little boy and when Saul finally dies, so that now he can become king in the full sense. The second period is his rise to power, in which David does a miraculous job of going from just a nobody to building an empire, actually, for the time. And then the third period is his mature, in quotes, reign, which turns out to be a train wreck. Yeah. We'll see you next week.